Hello, garden workshop attendees. I have to admit this is a little bit strange talking to a phone, but usually in these workshops it's really an exchange where you can ask questions and we can have a dialogue. So just want to say right up front that if you have questions, if you're confused about something that I say in this workshop, please post your questions in the discussion on the event page. My name is Hannah Hemmelgarn. I'm the Education Coordinator at the Center for Agroforestry at MU. And instead of being at the Ag Park for the Farmers Market, today we're in my yard, in my yarden, as I like to say. And since we're talking about shade plants and mushrooms and medicinal plants that either do well in shade or are even shade obligate, need shade, I'm just going to introduce you to some of my favorite plants in that category. So right here we're standing next to a serviceberry tree or shrub, and you can see the serviceberry is about to bloom. Serviceberry is one of the first trees to bloom in the spring, and they smell amazingly sweet. The insect pollinators think so too, and they're also one of the first trees to put on berries, really tasty berries that are, I think they taste sort of like a cross between a cherry and a blueberry. So they'll have these clusters of delicious berries that you can harvest hopefully before the birds get to them. So serviceberry is a really nice option, either out in the sun, they seem to do all right, or in the shade of an existing canopy tree. So at our house we have a wonderful red oak tree, and acorns are one of those tree foods that I think are really underutilized, but can certainly be a source. Car go by. It can be an important source of nutrition, not only for humans but also, of course, for the urban wildlife that we love. So let's go on to the next plant. Oh, well, here we have a red bud, of course, and if you have a red bud in your outdoor space, you know that they spread very easily. So that's something that not everyone really likes about red bud, but they are just about to bud out also, and these are really tasty flowers in the springtime. Little pea-like flowers in the legume family. So redbud is a really nice, really beautiful tree, I think, and also native, of course. And this is one that I planted just last year, so it's still pretty small, but this is a Staghorn Sumac coming back up this year. And the sumac berries make a really nice, sort of a lemonade drink. Lovely plant. So as we're thinking about shade plants, of course not all shade is equal. Sometimes you have a really dense shade and it's really only those plants that thrive in shade that will do well there. And other times you might have more like an edge space. And so that's what's going on here, where there's a thick row of Rose of Sharon, another plant that easily spreads. I didn't plant this Rose of Sharon, but I am planting some what I would think of as companion plants who will get along pretty well with Rose of Sharon and hopefully keep them at bay a little bit. So I'll introduce you to some of them. Let's see, so one that I like a lot, this is a really nice option for a sunny edge. This is hazelnut or filbert, and this hazelnut is a cross between the European and American hazelnut. There's still a lot of work to be done on hazelnut breeding that the Center for Agroforestry is working on in order to have a more blight resilient plant with bigger nuts. But for now, they're a really great option for urban plantings. And I've also put in some Sandhill plums here. This is a native plum. So we have the American plum and the Sandhill plum. Sandhill plums, from what I understand, are a little bit bigger and sweeter, so that's why I chose the Sandhill plum. but they're really resilient, hardy plants, so they should do fairly well on this edge with the vinca and the Rose of Sharon encroaching. So let's go now to the backyard, see what's going on there. We have more shade in the backyard. I'll be able to introduce you to some of the plants that I love for shady spaces. So in this part of the yard, this is typically a pretty sunny space, but I'm thinking of this as eventually becoming long-term a little bit of a food forest plot. So I have a peach tree growing here. We've got a few peach trees planted in this space, and below the peach tree we've got violets coming up here, and these are edible greens. They're still pretty small, but they taste great. We've got some dandelions. I did not plant the dandelions or the violets, but I'm happy with them being there as a ground cover. And then also, of course, strawberries that are planted here that seem to get along pretty well with the violets and the dandelions. And the tops of the dandelions and violets are, of course, edible. The roots are also medicinal. So there's a lot we can do with these plants. And then coming over here to the corner, this is a shady spot even right now. You can see this Rudbeckia laciniata, or golden glow, coming up. These are also edible greens you can cook like spinach. They have beautiful yellow flowers in the summer. And here we may have seen some of this in the front. This is a purple dead nettle, and purple dead nettle is also edible, an edible weed. I think they taste a little bit better before they've flowered. A lot of plants get a little bit bitter after they've gone to flower, just like if you've ever had a lettuce bolt. Once the lettuce goes to flower, it really tastes pretty bitter. So along this edge, we can see some of the perennials that tolerate some shade. They'll still do well in sun, but these are perennial also. This is a perennial walking onion, and they're planted alongside these black raspberries. So both of these are really part of this food forest space. And we've only been here for not quite 2 years, and we spent the better part of that first year really observing this space. So most of these plants were just planted last year, and they are already coming up and doing really well. So I'm happy to see that. Okay, let's go now to the mushroom bed. So this is one that we've had in place for a little while, and I was planning on doing a demonstration at the Ag Park where they're going to be setting up some mushroom beds there, hopefully this spring still. But for now, to show you one that's set up, I can explain a little bit how we did this. You can order what's called Mycelium Spawn. I really like Field and Forest. Their website is fieldforest.org. That's where I usually get my Mycelium Spawn, and you can think of it like the seed for the mushroom inoculation process. So the mushrooms we have growing here are Stropharia rugoso annulata, and Stropharia, some of the common names are wine cap or garden giant. They're fairly easy to grow, and there aren't any coming up right this minute, but I can show you the mycelium in this bed. So what you're looking for, this process, you're layering wet straw and wood chips often together that have been soaked for a little while, or at least heavily watered, layering almost like a lasagna garden bed, layering that straw, soaked straw and wood chips in with sprinkling this mycelium spawn. And eventually, usually for Stropharia, it takes maybe 6 or 8 months, before you should start seeing this mycelium when you dig a little bit in the bed. You might even have some critters do that digging for you so you can see what's going on underneath. And one of the really important things to keep in mind when you're inoculating a mushroom bed is, well, the sunlight, the amount of sunlight. Stropharia can tolerate a little bit of light, but they really do need some shade. And also the amount of food that the mycelium has. So in order for that mycelium to do what's called running, for that mycelium to run and start to occupy that space, you have to make sure that it's got the right level of moisture and the right amount and kind of food. So if you start with a really old straw bale that looks like it already maybe has some mycelium growing in it, you're a lot less likely to have success with these mushroom beds. So you want to make sure you have a growing medium that doesn't already have other mycelium going on, and that you've got the moisture and also some aeration. So as you're doing this layering process, one thing you can do to make sure that the moisture level stays about right is put a nice thick, maybe 2 or 3 inches of straw on top of your finished mushroom bed. And this might not look like it has very many layers in that lasagna method, but it really does sort of compress down over time. And in the first year, you should see some mushrooms popping up. It's also important that you do these mushroom beds in a place where you're likely to be able to see them, because very quickly these Stropharia especially, they'll pop up, they'll open up, and they'll get to a point where they don't taste quite as good if you harvest them. And other little flies and insects like to get in there too, so they might beat you to eating them unless you're really watching those beds. Got some more red bud here and another Sandhill Plum. And then we'll go over to another one of the mushroom cultivation areas in our yard. Shiitake is a mushroom that a lot of people are more familiar with, that can be grown on logs. And when we got this place, the former owners of this house had a little fort structure for their kids. So we took advantage of this nice shade. Shiitakes and other log-grown mushrooms really need at least 75% shade. So this seemed like a great spot. We usually keep it fully covered, and then we can just pull aside the pallet. And these logs are not fresh. You can see some of the bark is starting to peel off a little bit, and that's okay. They're still producing mushrooms. So you can see those shiitakes pinning out. We've had some really nice rains, and we've been harvesting shiitakes from this log, and now that the sun is out, they're drying out a little bit, so they'll probably be ready to harvest pretty soon. And I'm not going to get into the details of log inoculation, log mushroom cultivation, but if you order spawn from Field and Forest, or really any other Mycelium Spawn company, they'll give you full instructions on how to do that. The Center for Agroforestry also has some wonderful resources on our website, centerforagroforestry.org, where you can find some really comprehensive instructions and more information about growing and selling shiitakes. Another plant that I love that's right over here is witch hazel, and I like to leave the tags on these as much as I can. So you can see here these beautiful late winter blooms. This one is a little bit young to have the blooms, but seems to be doing well with the ends of those buds coming out. Witch hazel is typically used as a medicinal plant with the bark. So if you were to do some pruning of the witch hazel, you could strip the outer bark and do an extraction in alcohol to pull that medicine out. Okay, and as promised, I will do an elderberry planting demonstration next. We have some elderberries already growing in our yard here, and I'll point one out that's just popping up right now. So let's see, right here is one. You can see some new growth. Elderberry, or Sambucus canadensis, is one of my very favorite plants, and one that's been really popular for agroforestry plantings in recent years. It's just easy to grow. They are at their yields. They start yielding early within the first couple years. You can harvest the berries or the flowers. They're medicinal and edible. Just lots of wonderful things about elderberry. So elderberry is one that can be grown in full sun, and you're more likely to get more berries and more flowers in full sun, but also does really well in shade. So right now we're underneath a locust tree, and this locust tree is a really nice canopy that offers some shade, but there's some light that comes through too because of the shape of the leaves and the structure of the leaves. So all you really need to grow elderberry is a trowel, and if you have some pruners, so those come in handy, and some cuttings from the elderberry canes. So these are pretty freshly cut, so they don't have much root growth going on, but you can see on the bark of this elderberry cutting, and this was probably pretty high up on the elderberry plant, so it doesn't really matter that the roots can come out from anywhere. You can see these little bumps. They're called lenticels, and that's where the roots will start to grow once they've been in water for just a few days. So I typically like to let them root a little bit before I plant them, but they should do just fine as long as there's enough water in whatever site. You'll typically see them growing wild along streams, and that's the case for a lot of, we have a pretty wet backyard, so that's the case for a lot of the plants that we've chosen to include here. So I will just demonstrate this planting process. Different people, I think, do it different ways. What has worked well for me is to angle the bottom of the cutting. That's a good way to remember which side is down and which is up, and also to help give it some a little extra pointiness as it's going into the ground. And then I'm going to plant this all the way up to right below this top bud, so that all of these little lenticels can grow roots and support the new growth of just this one top bud. So I've selected a spot over here, and we can see there's more of this dead nettle, and we've got these are some wild strawberries that the berries don't actually taste so great, and more violets, and some blooming violets that are of course also edible and delicious. And I'm just gonna dig a little into here to aerate, give it some space. And it's been pretty wet here, so it's not ideal conditions for planting. But once I loosen that, you can also add a little bit of compost. That can help with that new growth. But these are pretty hardy, so I'm just gonna push that into the earth and fill this in. And it's great if you can remove some of the other vegetation around the plant so that it doesn't have to compete. And then give it some extra mulch. Whatever you have on hand. Leaves are great, straw, grass clippings, just to remember that spot and give the plant some nourishment. So that's all it takes to plant elderberry. And once you have elderberry growing, you'll have elderberry for a long time. Like I said, they're really hardy, really resilient plants, and every year they'll send up growth as tall or taller than me with those berries and flowers. And then in the winter, it's a good practice to cut those canes back just about to the ground to reduce disease and pest pressure. And then you can cut those cuttings into little segments just with a couple of those bud nodes on each cutting and share them with friends. And before you know it, you'll all have elderberries. So that's the process for elderberry. And there are just a couple other plants I'd like to show you that are back here that are just starting to come up. One is pawpaw. So we've planted a few pawpaw that we started from seed last fall, and planting them from seed is just fine. The genetics of the pawpaw from seed is really variable. So if I were to just let this tree grow out, I'm not sure what the fruit would be like, if it would be very sweet or very abundant. So what I'm going to do is in a year or two, I'll graft onto this pawpaw with a known cultivar that has really nice quality fruit and does well. And that good root structure will support that graft, and we'll have pawpaws a lot sooner, a lot tastier pawpaws to choose from. And let's see, one last little area. So this is another spot where it's pretty full shade in the summertime, but we have really, really full shade back in the corner over here. So let's go over there. And here you can see we've got lots of vinca coming up along this fence line. So I do my best to keep vinca at bay. Vinca and ivy, English ivy, these are plants that are invasive, exotic invasives, and they really like shade too. So if you're not interested in any kind of edible, native, medicinal plants in your shady spaces, certainly vinca is a plant that people really like as a ground cover. But because it does spread so easily, it becomes problematic, kind of like the Bradford or Callery pear is a well-known plant, a tree that has been loved as an ornamental, and now we're learning the problem with that. But also here is one of my very favorite plants. This is ramps, Allium tricokum. Ramps are native, and they're not all that common anymore because they have been over-harvested. So I transplanted some ramp bulbs here last spring, and we've put some seeds in also from the fall, and these seem to be doing pretty well on this really shady spot. So on a hot day like today in the spring, they might look a little wilty like this, but in order to preserve the populations of these ramps, a lot of people, these are also called wild leeks if you're more familiar with that name. A lot of people, when they harvest ramps, they'll dig the whole bulb. And that's really problematic because these plants take many years to get to their mature bulb state. So instead of harvesting the bulb, what you can do is just harvest one of the larger leaves from each plant that has more than one leaf. And that way the plant will still be able to go to seed, they'll still be able to reproduce and sustain the population. So that's ramps. Some of my other favorite shade obligate medicinal plants are not quite up yet, at least not here, but they are, the ones that I have planted here are stinging nettles. So stinging nettles, is good to plant those in a space where you're not going to be walking barefoot very much because they do sting. Urtica dioica is the stinging nettle. Neighbor dogs. And stinging nettle is so nutritious, really high in minerals, so really tasty cooked. Just avoid eating it raw. Bloodroot and golden seal are a couple others that are beautiful and really in need of our support and in this relationship between humans and plants. So with that, thank you for joining me on this little garden tour, and like I said, feel free to leave your questions in the discussion area on the page, or reach out to me. You can find my contact information and all kinds of resources on all of these plants at centerforagroforestry.org. If you are a podcast listener, you can also check out the Agroforestry podcast on any podcast app. Kind of a fun way to learn more about some of these plants and how they fit in, especially to agricultural settings. So thanks again, and I hope to see you all in person at some point. The elderberry cuttings that I offered to share, I am going to leave in a couple buckets at the Veterans Farm at the corner of Smith and Fay. And you'll see they'll be tied with a little polka dot ribbon. So you know those are the elderberries. Just take as many as you need. A few cuttings should be plenty. And I believe there are some seeds there too near their little free library. So I hope you enjoy that. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you around.